Host here at the University of New Haven. It is my honor, on behalf of our planning committee, to welcome all of you to the university's 19th Annual Holocaust Remembrance. Our ceremony is closely coincident with observances currently taking place all over the world. As we begin, I ask that everyone silence their mobile phones. And now, please rise as the University of New Haven's Army ROTC Color Guard presents our nation's colors. You may be seated. That this event has become a tradition at the university is most fitting. What we commemorate today, the Holocaust, was a singular event of the 20th century, of modern history, so tragic, so immense in the magnitude of its horror, so difficult to comprehend even decades after its occurrence, that it commands us as teachers and students, and all of us are both teachers and students, to make every effort to cultivate the tolerance and understanding that should be the hallmark of our humanity, even while we are preoccupied with our ordinary studies. The Holocaust included the systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews, 1/4 of whom were children, by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. Holocaust is a word of Greek origin meaning sacrifice by fire. The Nazis, who came to power in Germany in January 1933, believed that Germans were racially superior and that the Jews, deemed inferior, were an alien threat to the so-called German racial community. Like all fire, the Holocaust burned wherever the triad of hatred, power, and indifference to suffering convened within Nazi territory. Consequently, many millions of people belonging to other groups suffered death, tremendous loss, and unimaginable suffering in connection with Nazi efforts to complete their ultimate goal, the complete annihilation of European Jewry. The thorough persistence of the Nazi regime in effecting their evil purpose, combined with the generally inadequate assistance proffered by the rest of the civilized world, resulted in the loss of 2/3 of European Jewry. The Holocaust was among the greatest of calamities to befall the Jewish people, who in their long history have had many tragic events to recall. Today's observance is intended to solemnly honor, with utmost dignity, the memory of those who were slaughtered. Such an act of respect and remembrance is entirely in keeping with Jewish custom and with what is good and commendable in our general cultural tradition. But that is hardly all that motivates our observance today. Equally important is the opportunity it provides to instill in our students the clearest possible lessons on the importance of ethical behavior, particularly in the context of respect for human life and dignity in all of its manifest diversity. This is an objective of the University of New Haven, and we take it quite seriously, as evidenced by its sponsorship and cultivation of many other related activities and programs. As just a few examples, the university has established the Myatt Center for Diversity and Inclusion, The College of Arts and Sciences has added courses that focus on this immense tragedy, and the Poland Study Abroad program has come to involve Holocaust education, which includes visits to Auschwitz and the Auschwitz Jewish Center. Also, very significantly, we have created the Oskar Schindler Humanities Endowed Professorship, which rotates every 3 years on a competitive basis to a professor who will dedicate research and academic time working with students to inculcate principles underlying the highest standards of human conduct, to do research in this area, and to engage related students in research projects. 3 of our university's previous Schindler professors, Mario Gabori, Marty O'Connor, and David Schroeder, are in attendance and will participate later in the program to read memorial names. As we commence our ceremony, let us take note that today, April 19, is the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The uprising began after German troops and police entered the ghetto to deport its surviving inhabitants. Jewish insurgents inside the ghetto resisted these efforts. This was the largest uprising by Jews during World War II and the first significant urban revolt against the German occupation in Europe. By May 16, 1943, the Germans had crushed the uprising and deported surviving ghetto residents to concentration camps and killing centers. This afternoon, as we remember those who tragically perished in the Holocaust, we also remember those massacred French citizens of a remote western central farming village of Oradour-sur-Glane. In the final months of the deadliest World War in history, and just 4 days after the Allies had successfully invaded occupied France, the SS Panzer II Division murdered some 643 men, women, and children in the village of Oradour-sur-Glane. We are reminded of this because recently, on February 11th, the last survivor of this brutal slaughter, Robert Ebras, died at age 97. Ebras and his neighbors woke that beautiful June day to shouts and commands to assemble in the main square. Soon, the SS herded the men into barns and shot them, while the women and children were forced to a nearby church. The barns were set on fire, and grenades were thrown at the church. Robert Ebras, age 19, survived the massacre even though he had been shot. He lay underneath a pile of his dead neighbors and later escaped through the burning village into the countryside. Even 79 years later, we do not have a definitive reason for these murders except for the Nazi brutality of the human condition. The French were traumatized by this atrocity, and at the time, General Charles de Gaulle ordered that the village should remain untouched as a memorial to these French martyrs, which it has to this day. I will now turn the podium over. Ira Kleinfeld, Professor Emeritus and Chair of the University's Planning Committee, is our Master of Ceremonies.
We begin with the ceremonial lighting of candles, which is in keeping with the Jewish tradition of remembering and memorializing the dead. It has become our custom here at UNH to light 8 candles, one for each of the million Jews who were slaughtered, making 6 in number, one in recognition of all the other groups who were ruthlessly and wantonly slaughtered, such as Jehovah's Witnesses, gays and lesbians, the mentally and physically handicapped, and civilians like those killed at Oradour-sur-Glane. And the 8th, in recognition of those righteous individuals who stepped forward to give aid and comfort at very great personal risk to themselves and to their families. The candles will be lit by our student lighters who are named in the program. Candles lit, I now have the very great pleasure to call upon Judy Burke to read her poem entitled, I Am a Survivor, which is part of the memoir she has written of her family's experience. Mrs. Burke, who served for many years as an arts writer for the New Haven Register, was miraculously taken as a baby by her mother while the war was already raging in 1941 from Hamburg to Lisbon, where they were able to sail to safety to New York. Mrs. Burke's father perished in a forced labor detail in Hamburg, so she never got to know him.
I am a survivor. I am the child of a survivor. I am a child survivor. The silence surrounded me. The noise now makes itself known. It resides in my being, one that has always borne and continues to bear the imprint of my origins. I live with an inheritance that begins to surface, intricate and abiding. The past intrudes upon the present. The circumstances pass from one life to another, in utero and beyond. A lineage inherited and integrated, now mine. I have no memories of that period. I have minimal knowledge of its retelling. Still, I retain its permanent scar. I reflect on this life as a survivor, as the child of a survivor, as a child survivor. The circumstances, visceral and intellectual, all meaningful in discovering and releasing the essence of my being, finding at long last the person I was meant to be. Realization has been difficult. Acceptance has taken time. Discovery and release. It gives me calm. It gives me peace. It allows me to stop running. It allows me to catch up with myself. It enables me to embrace my being with grace and gratitude and understanding. I am sad. I am happy. I am no longer silent. And yet, I continue to keep death near. I continue to let out a breath at the end of each day. I continue to live in fear of imminent danger. I continue to wonder at the achievement of each milestone. I continue to seek places in which to find shelter. I continue to grasp at the rim. I continue to hang on. Sometimes I succeed.
Thank you, Judy, for that very moving rendition. As the poet has fervently urged, we now ready ourselves to hear, to listen carefully, and to take heed. At an interview some time before his death, Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel was quoted as saying, "I believe fervently that to listen to a witness is to become a witness." With that in mind, I have the very great honor to introduce our keynote speaker for today's ceremony, Daphne Geismar. Ms. Geismar is the daughter of Holocaust survivors. She plans, designs, and produces books on art and history for museums and publishers. After finding an extraordinary family archive, she spent 14 years creating a book about her extended Jewish family in the Nazi-occupied Netherlands, which she entitled Invisible Years. Through interwoven letters, diaries, and interviews, she presents the story of 9 family members, her parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles, in their own words, alongside a trove of photographs and other artifacts. This family's detailed account of one of history's most horrific chapters challenges us to follow their examples of resistance to inhumanity. While she comes forward, I'll ask those students who just came in to find seats. There are plenty.
Anyone who wants, come have a seat, and then I think we're going to dim the lights. It's an honor to be here to remember together and to share with you the stories of my family members' experiences under Nazi occupation in the Netherlands. My deep dive into this history began when I learned that my grandparents, Chaim and Fifi de Zoete, were hidden in a church attic in Rotterdam for 2 years. After visiting the church in 2006, I returned to the United States and asked my mother to tell me more. She led me to an antique desk and opened the bottom drawer, which was filled with my family members' letters, diaries, and documents about their experiences during the Holocaust. These are some of the over 50 primary sources pulled from the drawers that make up the narrative for my book, as well as some of the photographs and artifacts. The 8 family members who left us their writings became the narrators of my book, Invisible Years. And those who did not write letters or keep journals, or those who maybe did and we didn't find them, are those whose stories we don't have, and it makes me realize the importance of telling your story. The lining paper at the bottom of my mother's Holocaust drawer became the end papers of my book. The narrators are the de Zoete family, my maternal grandparents, Chaim and Fifi de Zoete, with their 3 young daughters, Judith, Miriam, and Hadassah. Miriam is my mother, and she's in the middle of this photograph. My uncle, Natan Cohen, and my father and grandfather, David and Erwin Geismar. Here are all 8 narrators. My grandparents were in their early 40s when the Germans occupied the Netherlands. My mother, father, aunts, and uncles were children when the war started. When I first read through all of my family members' accounts, I realized that no one person had the complete story, but their collective accounts made it whole. My family members offered multiple perspectives on their shared experiences. So I cut up everyone's accounts, created content groupings, and then sequenced the groupings and excerpts within them to create a single narrative. When I first read the interwoven voices, it was like my family members were speaking to me, and also like they were speaking to one another in the way that they actually never could. By listening to this conversation, I finally understood how the genocide happened, how racist policies slowly took away their rights and the rights of all Jews, how it started with words from politicians and was perpetuated by silent individuals, how the inconceivable became the new normal, and how my family members felt when they lost their freedom, identity, and the people they loved. That's when I put my head on the table and wept, and when I knew I had to share their stories with anyone who would listen. In the first 4 chapters of Invisible Years, titled Before, Trapped, Forbidden, and Separated, the narrators coexist in their homes and communities, so their voices in the book are interwoven. In the section titled Invisible, the narrators go into hiding separately. They're isolated from one another, so their voices are separate. When the narrators come out of hiding and are reunited in the chapter titled After, their voices are interwoven and joined again. Hitler's goal was to remove Jews from Dutch society so he could make the Netherlands and its Aryan population part of Germany. The removal of Jews happened over a 2-year period. Slowly, the Nazi civil administration prohibited Jews from work, school, public places, transportation, communication, owning property, associating with non-Jews, and so much more. Deporting them to concentration camps was then just one more step. The chapter titled Forbidden groups anti-Jewish orders, like those I just listed, with the 8 narrators' accounts of how each discriminatory law affected their lives. I'm going to read, we're going to work in a few excerpts from my family members, and my husband, Rob, and my friend Jean are going to join me on the stage for excerpt readings. Since the book is in the voices of multiple people, we decided to give you some multiple voices here.
After the radios were confiscated in spring 1941, and we were prohibited from cafes and bars in the summer, Jews could not travel without a permit. All Jewish valuables were confiscated, and everyone was required to deposit their assets in a special bank created for this purpose. That was Erwin, Daphne's grandfather. This is Natan. Every year there was a fair in Apeldoorn, and in 1942 was no exception. Signs forbidding entry for Jews were displayed. I once went anyway, but did not enjoy it, since I felt like a fugitive, even while riding the merry-go-round, which usually was one of my favorite attractions, with its loud papa music.
I'm reading the voice of Miriam, Daphne's mother. Jews were not allowed to own cars or bicycles, and we weren't allowed to go on the tram anymore. My sisters and I left for school on our scooters for a tiring 1-hour trip each way.
David, we wondered, why are we losing everything when we are no different from our friends who aren't Jewish?
In August 1941, just before the school year was to start, Jewish children were forbidden from attending public schools. This is a photograph of Miriam's class before the occupation. She's in the second row wearing a dark flower print dress. Chaim and Fifi made arrangements for the girls to go to an improvised school with Jewish teachers. Miriam's opinion about this?
We were about to be murdered by the Nazis, and our parents were still worried about our education.
In the spring of 1942, Jews were ordered to wear a Jewish star on their clothing. We found my Aunt Judith's Jewish star in her Holocaust drawer with a book that she hid the star in. My parents told us how they felt about wearing the star.
You were a non-person, a person people didn't want to associate with. You were different. Maybe you are bad because the Germans said Jews are bad. It makes you feel like you are nothing.
And David, in his usual straightforward manner, oops.
We were marked.
On July 5th, 1942, summons were sent to 4,000 Jews to report for transport to concentration camps in the East. On this same date, telephone service was disconnected for Jews. Jews had few options for escape. 1 month later, 2,000 Jews were rounded up. Raids increased as Jews went into hiding rather than show up for transport. A relatively small and dedicated number of non-Jewish Dutch citizens resisted German occupation. Their activities included hiding 28,000 Jews, although 40,000 were looking for hiding places. On August 19, 1942, the D'Souza girls, ages 9, 10, and 11, left their parents and each other to go into hiding. Their cousins, Hetty and Miriam, in this photograph, reported for transport with their parents. My mother, Miriam, wrote,
My mother's sister Jet and her husband thought that as long as we did exactly what the Germans said, then we'd be okay. They went when they were told to go for the transport. They went with their 2 kids, including their oldest daughter, my best friend, who had the same name as me. They went, and they never came back.
In the chapter titled Invisible, we learn about the narrator's long-term hiding places, where they were invisible for more than 2 years. The timeline summarizes what is happening at parallel moments with the narrator's politics, society, and the war. A map of the hiding addresses for the 8 narrators follows the chapter opener. In total, the map shows 27 documented hiding addresses for 8 people. When parents and children were separated and went into hiding, they were isolated from the world and one another. This is where the structure of the book changes. The narrators' voices are no longer interwoven. Each has a separate hiding chapter where they tell about their unique experiences. Some could never leave their hiding places, others hid in plain sight. There were Nazi raids on 2 hiding places. My maternal grandparents were not discovered. My paternal grandfather was. Most protectors were remarkable humanitarians. One was a Nazi sympathizer, and the father and 2 sons of one family were abusive. Before going into hiding, the 3 D'Souza girls had their braids cut and their names changed. They were told not to cry because their departure had to look as normal as possible. Judith and Hadassah left home together. Shortly after, they were placed in separate homes. Judith wrote about the day they left. After arrangements were made, our parents told Hadassah and me, go to Uncle Keith's, but before you reach his house, make a stop under one of the bridges. Take off your jacket with the Jewish star and leave it there. Once you reach his house, he will take care of everything. I took off my jacket under the bridge, put it in the bag I had with me, and forgot about it. At that moment, I didn't realize the danger of keeping the star. Miriam wrote about the sleeping arrangements at the home of Nell Van Fleet, where she hid with 3 other Jewish children.
For a short while, we slept in regular beds in different rooms. Then the Germans started to unexpectedly search homes for hidden weapons, hidden Jews, and hidden pilots. It became too dangerous at night. The 4 of us had to sleep under the kitchen floor because you couldn't get to a hiding place fast enough. Every night at 7, for the remaining years of the war, more than 2 years, we said goodnight, and the 4 of us went down into our little night prison.
All of the D'Souza girls had to change hiding places multiple times. Their parents lost track of where they were. They sometimes suffered from lack of food and were always in danger. When Judith had to leave the home where she was hiding with 3 older women, because of increased raids in the neighborhood, she was taken to a farm owned by a family with 8 children, not knowing the horror that she was about to endure. When Judith realized our book would be published, she made the difficult decision to share her complete story. She had written about it with plans to leave it for her daughters to read after her death. You're looking at the back of a photograph of the couple who hid Judith. In the photograph on the other side of this paper, they're receiving recognition for hiding her. At the bottom, in Judith's handwriting, you can read the crimes of the father and 2 of his sons. This is an excerpt from Judith's letter. The last family I was hiding with was where it happened. The father and 2 of his sons, 16 and 17 years old, abused me. There was nothing I could do and nobody I could go to. I never told my parents. Years after, Poppy submitted their names to the righteous list in Yad Vashem. And sometime later, they sent us a letter with pictures of the ceremony in the Israeli consulate. where they got a medal and a certificate and trees planted in their name for saving a Jewish life. In 2016, Judith, her daughters, and I requested that this person's name be removed from the Righteous at Yad Vashem. I met with the director of the Department of the Righteous and gave her Judith's written account. The Yad Vashem board and a judge reviewed the case, and his name was removed. This is Judith's bear that she had with her the whole time she was in hiding. 7 years after visiting the Rotterdam church and learning about the Holocaust drawer, I found this drawing of that my grandfather Chaim had made of his hiding place in the church. It accompanied his account of a terrifying Nazi raid that took place in April 1945. My grandparents had been hiding in the attic for 2 years and would be liberated the following month. Chaim wrote a detailed account of the raid. Here's an excerpt.
I hear someone walking through the church, so I go over to the window from where the organist has a full view. Carefully, I hold the edge of the opaque green curtain against the wall and use my finger to create a small crack, only to grow rigid with fear. On the podium below me, between the pews, there are 2 green police walking around, searching everything. And then comes a stage of paralysis, the sense that all is lost.
61 years later, I stood in that organ loft. And during a moment alone, I pulled back the curtain to look into the nave, just as my grandfather had, when he saw the Nazi police searching between the pews.
There's still a small chance. Now the super heavy ladder still has to be raised. It can't be done hand over hand because that would make the ladder sway and bump. Throw it up, let it go, and catch it again, 10 centimeters at a time. One slip and that's the end. For the Germans are already below me in the foyer. I close the trapdoor and cover the cracks with a cloth.
75% of Jews in the Netherlands were murdered. The majority of those who survived did so by hiding. When my family members, the narrators, come out of hiding and are reunited in the chapter titled After, their voices are interwoven again. In 1945, my grandmother Fifi wrote in her diary, "You can hardly comprehend that our family emerged from that hell in one piece." They emerged, but the lives they had no longer existed. Other people were living in their homes. Years of education were lost. They couldn't relate to their old friends or family members, and David's father, Erwin, did not return. The top row is from before the 1940 German occupation, the bottom row after the 1945 liberation. They went in as children and came out as adults. After the war, Chaim wrote a 70-page letter to his daughters in an effort to make sense of life in the aftermath of the mass murders and crimes committed during the Holocaust. This is from the first page of his letter.
When we were free once again, it was as if life itself had been put back into our hands, for our very life had been stripped from us. Gladness and gratitude overwhelmed me. Gratitude to all who supported us during the war years, and an emotion of thankfulness that I will call divine. But this feeling was almost immediately stifled, remembering just one of the millions of children who had not returned. Surely countless ones among them must have been 1,000 times more deserving than we.
A few years ago, a film was discovered that brought the happy pre-war Dezuta girls to life. Watching it was amazing. I tell my family's story so we can see how dictators rise, how people are oppressed, and how their rights are slowly taken away. And I also do it for my ancestors. These are the words from my grandfather, Erwin's memoir, written shortly before he was murdered in Auschwitz.
In the end, I hope that my lines will be read by people who will see how we struggled under terrible circumstances, and that the reader will want to take up this struggle that we have fought and experienced from the front lines for the construction of a worthwhile, humane society.
In a humane society, we look at our common humanity and embrace our differences. We can take up the struggle when we see a leader trying to gain unlimited power. We can take up the struggle when we see patterns of discrimination, dehumanization, and persecution. We can take up the struggle when we see hate or intolerance by governments or individuals towards groups or a single human being. Of the 8 narrators in Invisible Years, 7 survived. When they came out of hiding, they learned that 61 close family members were murdered. This list remembers them. The youngest was 6 years old, the oldest 72. Remembering my relatives who were murdered, and remembering my relatives who survived because people risked everything to protect them, strengthens my commitment to help when help is needed. The witnesses in my family are my teachers and my inspiration. May they be yours too. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much for your profound message at today's remembrance. After the conclusion of our ceremony, copies of the book, Daphne's book, Invisible Years, will be available for purchase in the foyer of the theater, and she will be available for a book signing. While it is of utmost importance to remember the victims of the Holocaust, it is also necessary to pay special tribute to those individuals who offered aid and assistance, as was just pointed out. Those who provided refuge or escape, all the while at very great risk to themselves and to their families. To gain perspective on the character of such people, who exhibited the highest level of both humanity and courage, I draw on an anecdote of our second remembrance speaker, U.S. Representative Sam Gadenson, who addressed us in 2005. Representative Gadenson is himself the child of Holocaust survivors, his parents having been hidden during the war by a Polish farmer and his family. Reflecting on the meaning of the actions that his family's protectors had undertaken, Representative Gadenson admitted that the choices facing such a potential helper were so awesome in consequence that he could not honestly say that if he were in the same circumstances, that he'd be able to make the heroic decision that that Polish farmer did. The actions of righteous individuals are worthy of recognition, not only from a historical perspective, but also due to the tragic fact that the world has not yet changed sufficiently from the darkest days of the Second World War. Since then, the world has witnessed additional organized mass murders and genocide, including the killing fields of Cambodia, the internecine strife in Rwanda and Darfur, and in and across the Middle and Far East, in Syria and Myanmar, where many hundreds of thousands of refugees have fled for their lives. And most recently, we have all become acutely aware of the horrific events in Ukraine, which, although not genocide, constitute a premeditated, massive, cruel, and brutal assault on human life, which has led to death and destruction and a massive flood of refugees whose plight is overwhelming. What has occurred in Ukraine will likely come to be thought of as a crime against humanity, which is a concept in international law developed after World War II as one way to hold the Nazi leadership responsible for the genocide that they had perpetrated. We must also face the most troubling resurgence of violent and murderous hate crimes everywhere, even in our own country, where extremists have taken to the streets, aggressively trumpeting their racism and anti-Semitism. Considering all of this, it is imperative that we remind ourselves and teach our students about our common humanity. With all that in mind, I now introduce Captain Spencer Farabee, commanding officer of the ROTC program here, and Cadet Corbin Witt-Leitner. And the man we now pay tribute to, a man named Roddy Edmonds, was an American GI during World War II, a master sergeant who consciously chose to risk his life while taking the most courageous and outspoken stand in opposition to the Nazi regime's murderous practices. As Captain Farabee and Cadet Witt-Leitner come forward, I invite and encourage all armed forces veterans in our audience to rise, to be recognized for the dedicated service that they have provided. Thank you. You may be seated.
The tribute to Master Sergeant Roddy Edmonds. In the final days of 1944, the war was going well for the Allies. The invasion of Normandy only a few months earlier had turned the tide of combat for the Allies. And many American service members believed that their advancement to and through the borders of Germany was a prologue to the Nazis' eventual defeat. However, there was still a long way to go for Master Sergeant Roddy Edmonds of the 422nd Infantry Regiment. The Tennessee native had fought with distinction and was respected greatly by the men under his command. However, during the Battle of the Bulge, he was captured and spent the remaining 100 days of World War II serving as a prisoner of war, or a POW. It was during this time that our story of unparalleled leadership and inspiration plays out. Master Sergeant Edmonds was the highest-ranking American soldier at Stalag 9 Alpha in Ziegenheim, Germany, and therefore was in charge of approximately 1,000 American POWs contained within. The 1,000 souls are a lot to be responsible for, and knowing that some of those souls were Jewish and that the Wehrmacht was singling out these Jewish POWs for execution did not make it any easier. Now, leadership isn't tested when things are going well. Leadership is tested when the situation requires you to put yourself or others in harm's way in order to accomplish the mission. Master Sergeant Edmonds, as the ranking POW, had but one mission: the safety and the protection of the soldiers under his command. One January morning, the Nazi officers told the Jewish POWs to assemble outside of the barracks, and Master Sergeant Edmonds and the soldiers under his command knew exactly what this meant for the nearly 200 Jewish POWs currently stationed or contained within that camp. Master Sergeant Edmonds, acting quickly and decisively, ordered all 1,000 of his men to form up outside the barracks. And when the commanding officer, the Nazi officer, Major Siegmann, saw all 1,000 men assembled, he approached Master Sergeant Edmonds. "They cannot all be Jews," Major Siegmann yelled. To this, Master Sergeant Edmonds simply replied, "But we are all Jews." Major Siegmann then produced his pistol and threatened Edmonds with immediate execution.
They say leadership is a lonely enterprise, surrounded by 1,000 of his own men and literally with a gun to his head. I'll bet Master Sergeant Edmonds had never felt so alone. Yet in the face of this solitude, Edmonds showed his Nazi captor what true leadership looks like. Edmonds does not waver. He reported, "If you shoot me, you have to shoot us all. And after the war, you'll be tried for war crimes." Major Siegman looked around the assemblage of men, lowered his pistol, and walked away. The event never repeated itself, and soon the camp was liberated and the war was over. Edmonds returned home, lived out the rest of his life, and passed away in 1985. He never spoke of this event, and at least not to anyone at home. And it were not for two of the Jewish service members saved by Edmonds that fateful January morning, this story may have never been brought to our attention here today. In 2015, Yad Vashman posthumously recognized Edmonds as the righteous among nations. He's the first American soldier and only one of 5 Americans to have been bestowed this honor. For his astonishing commitment to the loftiest principles of humanity and exemplary leadership, his unwavering ethical belief in the importance of protecting those in charge, even in the face of his own destruction. Today we honor Master Sergeant Roddy Edmonds.
Thanks to both of you for reading this tribute to a most worthy man whose actions should serve as an inspiration for us. At this time, I'll ask the following individuals to join in an act of communal solidarity. Andrew Beardsley, University Office of Advancement. Spencer Farabee, Company Commander, University Army ROTC. Mario Gabbery, the university's first Oscar Schindler Professor and presently the Dean of the Henry C. Lee College of Criminal Justice and Forensic Science. Amy Holtz, Chief Executive Officer of the Jewish Federation of Greater New Haven. Lauren Kempton, developer and teacher for UNH's course, Genocide in Modern Times, The Call of Memory. Margie Lipshes Shapiro, retired Associate Director, Anti-Defamation League of Connecticut. Alan McDougall, Director of Educational Technology. Marty O'Connor, Associate Professor and former Schindler Professor. Paulette Pepin, Professor. Sidney Perry, Community Leader and Educator, our 2006 keynote speaker and original consultant for structuring this event. Ophelia Rowe Allen, Vice President of Student Affairs and Dean of Students. Nancy Savage, Provost. David Schroeder, Associate Dean of the Lee College and former Schindler Professor. Howard Stouffer, Professor. Bradley Woodworth, Associate Professor, and Shayan Zenger, President. On behalf of us all, they will read the names of those victims of the Holocaust who were relatives of members of our university family. While these names are being read, photographs are being projected for those that we have. I ask that after the last name has been read, we maintain a full minute of silence for personal contemplation and reflection.
Joseph Glucksman, Margaret Glucksman, Morris Chachko, Hannah Chachko, Ania Kortman, Hella Kortman.
Goldenberg family: David, Bernard, Yaakov, Avigdor, Ruchel, Yitzchak, Yosowitz family.
Balsia Kopman, Maurice Kopman, Pearl Kopman, Shlomo Morginsky, Aram Morginsky, Ephraim Morginsky.
Moshe Morginsky, Rivka Morginsky, the Goldenberg family, Shmuel, Amalia, Martin, and Toby.
Arnold Mensch, Ernestine Pisek, Anna Revzina, Israel Revzin, Hilka Rosset, Zizfra Rosset,
Martha Manasseh, Michael Markovic, Rahil Medvedeva, Shlomo Medvedev, Moshe Mendelovich, Rachel Mendelovich.
Samuel Bagelman, Burl Becker, Danny Becker, Edith Becker, Rudolph Benko, David Bober and family.
Helen Solomon, Freed. Ilona Freed. Elus Freed. Louis Freed. Elise Gossman. Greta Gossman.
Hasia Shiptalnik. Shmuel Shiptalnik. Haynes Sternheim. Ida Sternheim. Herman Sternheim. Ibaya Testler.
Louis Klein, Magda Klein, Milkos Klein, Sari Klein, Rose Kleinfeld, Lazar Kleinfeld.
Amalka Klein, Bertie Klein, Cornelia Klein, Francine Klein, Gabriel Klein, Hermina Klein, Joseph Klein.
Illis Solomon, Irma Solomon, Samuel Solomon, Thea Schuschel, Rita Schuschel, Heinz Schuschel.
Berta Diamond, Frank Friedman, Isadore Frank, Yulsa Grosinger, Benjamin Fried, Gisela Fried.
Hannah Gruenfeld, Laszlo Gruenfeld, Miriam Gruenfeld, Brigitta Yosef, Herta Yosef, Herman Uras, Selma Uras.
Miriam Weiss, the Tox family, Ikmer, Philip, Rachel, Hershey, Chana, and Golda, Leah Pfefferberg, Freema Drew Norwitz.
Jacob Glatstein, Joseph Bloder, Rose Bloder, Carl Kaufman, Regina Kaufman, Sevik Kaufman, Adek Kaufman.
Thank you. You may be seated. At this time, our cellist Thirza Bendokas and pianist Carrie Miller-Magg will perform Salut d'Amour, Opus 12, by Edward Elgar. Thank you. Our ceremony concludes with the chanting of a traditional Hebrew memorial blessing, worded specifically in memory of the 6 million. For this, we are very fortunate to have with us today Rabbi Michael Farbman, who has so ably served this community as spiritual leader, counselor, and teacher. His recent leadership and work in assisting Ukrainian refugees is most noteworthy and admirable. Rabbi.
As we try to mark the unimaginable tragedy, we grasp for something that can help us somehow make sense of it. Some try to do so by trying to imagine what 6 million of anything might actually be like. Some by trying to comprehend that 80 years on, we have just begun to approach the number of Jews in the world. We're a small people that existed before the war. If you've studied statistics or population growth, you will know how profoundly population grows and changes over such a period of time. We have just begun to approach the number of the pre-war. You may try and look at the war unfolding. So many of these difficult, challenging, horrendous things that have already been mentioned today. And yes, indeed, just recently Syria and now Ukraine. Trying to come to terms with the Shoah, with the Holocaust, is trying to come to terms with the fact that it did not matter whether you were young or old, whether you were educated or could not put the two and two together, whether you were rich or poor. None of the quality, whether you were willing to cooperate with whoever was waging the war or you were rebellious, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was whether you were Jewish, and the only thing that distinguished between those who survived and who did not was if they were somehow lucky enough to find themselves out of reach of this effort, or if they were one of a small number of people who were hidden by righteous, by people who stood up and risked everything. We remember by adapting the words of a traditional memorial prayer that asks for our loved ones to be wrapped up in the bond of eternal life, by acknowledging the loss of the 6 million. The traditional prayer is adapted to talk to them of Dayan al-Kiddush Hashem, in sanctification of God's name. But truth is, Many of them would have been secular. Some were not religious. It did not matter. And so we embrace them and we hold them in our memory as a people, recognizing that so many of us come from small families because our families have been decimated. And we continue to look at the world and remind ourselves and the world that we, as the world, let this happen. One of the most profound things that I have noticed at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., I suppose I never thought of it this way, was that more than half of people who sat around the table when the decision about the final solution, the so-called final solution, was made, had PhDs. These were not simpletons filled with hate. These were some of the best that the society could produce, educated, smart, successful. They found a way to turn all of that to hate. And we as a world have to continue to live with it and figure out how to be better, how to not allow things like this to happen. But on Yom HaShoah, which is indeed today, may we take a few moments to not draw lessons, but simply to remember. I invite you to please rise. El malei rachamim, shochen bamromim, hametzeh menucha nechona, tachat kanfei השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מסהירים, את נשמות 6,000,000 אחינו ואחיותינו שנהרגו על קידוש השם. אנא בעל הרחמים, יסתירם בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתם, אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבם, ונאמר Amen. Fully compassionate God on high, to our 6 million brothers and sisters murdered because they were Jews, grant clear and certain rest with you in the lofty heights of the sacred and pure, whose brightness shines like the very glow of heaven. Source of mercy, forever enfold them in the embrace of your wings, secure their souls in eternity. Adonai, they are yours. They will rest in peace. And let us say, Amen.
Thank you. Now that you may be seated. Now that our ceremony is over, I wish to thank all who worked to make it happen and who participated so beautifully today. At this time, I wish to thank Chancellor Stephen Kaplan for his steadfast support and commitment to this event and for all that it teaches our students. Also thanks to President Cheyenne Zenger and Provost Nancy Savage for their generous support and active participation, and to our Faculty Staff Planning Committee and the other university personnel whose names are listed in the program and without whom this annual remembrance would not take place. And now, at our conclusion, I want to pay special tribute both to our poet and to our keynote speaker, whose steadfast commitment and dedication will serve surely as an enduring example and an inspiration. After a very short respite, Daphne Geismar will make her way to the theater foyer, where she will appear for the book signing that I mentioned previously. Thank you one and all for coming.